Our next presentation comes from Thomas Thurston from Ducera.
Hi, so Thomas Thurston. I'm CTO of Ducera Partners, an investment bank in New York that we started a few years ago. And so I'm a user of systems. That means a few things. I'm used to being the dumbest person in the room, so definitely in this room. I also somehow, I'm the dumbest person in a lot of the rooms and have the biggest budget, and I'm the one who gets shot if I'm wrong. So it's a terrible place to be. But I'd love to just share some of the things we're thinking about and really looking for you to help us think about them better. So about the bank, we started about 10 years ago. The idea was to use compute to try to get advantages in investment banking. So think of, it's not day trading, it's not that kind of a thing. We need fast insights for slow transactions. So it's M&A deals, venture capital deals, big reorganizations, and those types of things. So can we actually leverage compute to do things that bigger banks can't do, that gives us an upstart, an advantage? So we started with 0 transactions. I just like to remind our team of that, but we've done almost $1 trillion in deals in 10 years. We do average about $100 billion a year. And we've done it with a team today that's just around 80 people. It was about half of that a couple years ago. So the idea is, how do we use actually smaller team and compute to get outsized impacts and results? So I'll talk about, as CTO, what that struggle is like, and kind of this question started to form around AI and HPC and the convergence, right? And how do we even begin to think about that? And at first, I think I was thinking about it the wrong way. It's sort of which one leads, right? Do we really want an AI system making the decisions, effectively handing tasks out to HPC? Or the opposite, do we want an HPC-gated system, being with In-Situ or other types of AI augmentation? And I think what we realized is, well, first we tried to figure out which system has more constraints, right? Because we're talking about a future state. We want to see how these things come together, AI and HPC, and where are all the bottlenecks in either version of the future to give us a sense of which future is more likely to get here. And again, I think we're asking the wrong question, because we realized no matter what happens, there's actually some nearer order problems or bottlenecks that we have to deal with before we can even worry about that, and maybe that doesn't matter at the end of the day. So I'll talk a little bit about the sort of how we use compute. Again, what we're doing is we're spend a lot of time trying to simulate market behavior. So not the stock market, but actual markets. If you think of outside the walls of this building, you have companies and products and competitors and vendors and supply chains. You have all of these things moving around in the globe, exchanging, and there's all kinds of dependencies. How do you model all of those things to understand specific transaction angles that we might be looking at in our bank? So, for example, how do you know if a startup is likely to succeed or fail in a new market that hasn't been created yet? Or how do you know if one company acquires another company, what that might do to some of its competitors? So how do you model all this complexity in a way that actually gives you really actionable insights that end up being true more often than not? So let me get into sort of how we started to try to decompose this question of HPC and AI coming together, look at bottlenecks and sort of where I felt like it took me. But again, part of me sharing this is to sort of be open about the journey and then get people who can help us think about it better, right? And I think that's sort of where we're at. So what do we do? So one of the things we can do is, we have a hierarchical classification model that can look at markets, effectively break them down into their value chains, decompose those value chains into market segments and subsegments, all the way down to critical technologies. So we can go from a market all the way down to specific. In this case, we looked at 7 overlapping value chains around HPC and AI and their convergence. Came to about 1,000 different sort of discrete technologies throughout all those value chains. Very specific granular levels, right? What are all the bits and pieces, hardware, software, in between, and sort of which of those are bottlenecks? So can we model supply and demand for all roughly 1,000 pieces and see, if you have much more demand than supply, well, that's a bottleneck. If you have much more supply than demand, that's excess capacity. So how do we understand it? Where are those choke points in this future where HPC and AI converge? And what can that tell us about our approach and how we might want to go into this, and what we should start budgeting and planning and building for in our own efforts? It's interesting. So I have my technical team, and then the rest of the organization are bankers. And I think you're going to see pretty quickly, to the bankers, I'm like a really super nerd, right? But to the real nerds, I'm just a banker or just a business person. So it's an interesting overlap in and of itself. But the short version is, so here's just more about what we found. So if you're looking at these roughly 1,000 different technologies and supply and demand for each and every one of them, we found, there were about 14% what we call severe bottlenecks, where we estimate demand is more than 15% greater than supply. Bottlenecks are just sort of 5 to 15%, if you will, more demand than supply. Excess capacity would be plus or minus 5%, and then, equilibrium's plus or minus 5%, and excess capacity is when you have more than 5% supply is higher than demand. So just trying to break this down, and we just need to be right directionally to understand, again, where's the push and pull, where are the issues in these futures. A couple things too. What we also found is the bottlenecks are the problem if you're trying to build a system, right? What's going to hold you back? What can't you get? What parts aren't available? You're going to have long wait times or other types of barriers. But they're also, as a business, and this is thinking of the HPC community, the bottlenecks are where all the money's made if you can solve those problems, right? It's because they're risks and threats that I need to mitigate as a user, but anyone who can control the bottlenecks is in a wonderful position where you not only get higher profits, you get much more influence across ecosystems. So NVIDIA is a great example. There aren't that many GPU vendors. So as long as that's a bottleneck, it's a wonderful monopoly to be able to have, right? So I think you should look at bottlenecks as they're both threats and opportunities. Whereas all the stuff that's solved, the excess capacity, those are important components. You still need them. It just means the market has provided solutions, so you can get them. It's not that hard, or equilibrium's more or less the same way. So it's interesting how the problem areas are actually the more interesting areas from an investment perspective. And perhaps as you're thinking about what do you build and where do you race, sort of race towards the problems. And the commoditized stuff, the saturated sort of excess capacity stuff, is maybe necessary but not as critical in terms of a capability you might want to develop for a competitive advantage. So, for example, in our deals and our venture funds, we're looking in bottlenecks for startups that are resolving them in interesting ways. And we basically ignore any startup that's in a part of the market that's excess capacity because we feel like there's already tons of vendors and there's already commoditization, so why bother? So just more thoughts of how we think about this. But not all bottlenecks are equal. They're not all likely to have the same durations, time-wise, and they're not all actionable, right? Some bottlenecks you just can't do anything about, right? And I think, for example, here you can see, the CUDA ecosystem. It's not something you can just solve right away, right? It's an entire ecosystem, and no startup is probably going to just take that over overnight. You almost have to live with that bottleneck or find a workaround, right? So some bottlenecks are regulatory, for example. So they're not all equally actionable. They don't have the same durations. They come in different shapes and sizes, and to solve them is quite a creative process, right? Or do you just avoid them altogether? So I think everybody in this room would already have been able to make this list of these recurring bottlenecks. If we had just given you a quiz at the beginning of this conference, you'd probably come up with the same list. So I don't think that's going to surprise you. But in addition to the technology bottlenecks, we're also able to look at what we just call non-technology nodes. So other barriers to adoption that have nothing to do with the availability of technology. So that could be, again, regulatory or business model or profitability, just reasons people don't do something even if the technology is available. So as we looked at these, first starting with the technology bottlenecks, this was kind of the big surprise, because I imagined all we think about in AI is, all these constraints and these technologies that we really can't get our hands on. But when we looked at it holistically through this analysis, looking at the whole value chain, we actually found that only about 3% of the bottlenecks in this idea of AI HPC convergence were sort of hardware-only problems. And I think we could run a lot of versions of this, but I was just surprised, even the order of magnitude. Very few of these problems were just about technology supply. Like, I can't get that part. Most of them were a combination of I can't get the technology, and even if I could get the technology, I've got there's other non-supply barriers that are in the way. And so when we did this, I wanted to share it because it shifted my thinking from a technology problem to a much broader problem. And that's part of what I wanted to share as well, because I don't think it makes the possible solutions a lot harder to imagine. Because I can imagine just how do I get more technology, right? How do I get capacity? How do I get allocation? But some of these problems are a lot mushier and intangible, but they're the ones that are really, really kind of sticky. So as the slide says, I think what we found, the real bottlenecks, beyond just the cut and dry, can I get the parts, were these things around trust, qualification. How do I know that my models are right? Or how do I know that, better question could be, how do I know I'm not fooling myself by believing in my models is maybe a better way to put it. So what tools and systems and capabilities help me have more confidence in the results I see? And it doesn't matter if I can run the system or not, if I can get the chips or not, if I really can't trust the outcome robustly. It turns out that's a first order problem that's actually much more daunting and pressing. So that was the better question. It went from where are the bottlenecks, what are the parts that I can't get in the AI HPC convergence, to, well, forget that. Actually, how do I even know if anything I do in our system is right at a fundamental level? And that's the kind of problem that I think is a little meatier that we need help on. So if we break down kind of just percentage-wise of sort of what these, non-technology barriers came up with, again, you've got scientific trust and validation, integration and interop, qual, regulatory, of course, some of just regulatory issues there, even standards and licensing things like CUDA and what have you as well. So that was a big, and then at the bottom row, you can just see, if we just look at all of the barriers, actually getting the parts isn't the hugest problem. The other thing we found is most of the segments are dominated a lot by incumbents, big players, most of whom have been around for a long time. So as a venture capitalist in that part of my brain, it's really hard to see a lot of opportunities for startups here. It's not that there aren't any, but all the obvious pieces of the value chain are taken mostly by players that have been there a very, very long time. So even though the area is brand new, this convergence of AI and HPC, we're seeing the players are very much similar. The folks that come to this conference every year and have for the last 25 years, right? It's, for the most part. So when you're an incumbent-dominant, heavily consolidated market structure, it's a kind of a different game. You have to try to figure out how to play. So, so part of it was just to kind of share what we found. Again, I think we can talk about technically how do we break down value chains, how do we do our classification, our data. I mean, that's a side conversation. I didn't want to clutter that up. Today, I just wanted to focus on sort of the big picture takeaways and really the questions I have. And in my business, again, we're doing billions of dollars worth of deals every year using the insights that we get out of our system. And the temptation is, HPC, and especially in HPC and AI convergence, that's the cutting edge, right? That's the pointy tip of the spear. So as a CTO at a bank, the more I can leverage the breaking cutting edge, the better. The more advantages we'll have relative to our competitors. But of course, the more risk we have to take on because we're going into the frontiers that haven't been well beaten, right? So really, this mix between hunger for what's, for an advantage, but also the terror of having to be right, puts you at a high risk situation. And you need the ecosystem to help you think through that and help provide the technologies, the tools, the systems, so that we can have more confidence. Because as you know, when we go from doing ensemble modeling and latent class analysis on a laptop to an enterprise cluster to HPC, right? Each level of scale just creates so much more, so many more unknowns, so much more complexity. Running it on different stacks, getting two answers, like which one's right? So, and those are the kinds of juicy problems that I think people like myself are really worried about, because we're going to be the ones again who are going to get bullet to the head against the wall if we're wrong. I don't get the luxury of hallucinations or happy accidents or learning experiences in my job. there's no like, oops, I'm sorry, I guess we were wrong, right? There's no sense of humor in my partnership about that, unfortunately. So I have to be really aware of when I'm deluding myself or being fooled by something that I can't see in the system at scale. And that's really the problem. And it doesn't actually matter to me now whether AI leads or HBC leads, or really no one leads, and it doesn't matter. My problem is much more affronting than that sort of more existential question. So that's my dilemma, but I hope it's helpful to sort of get one user's perspective as you're thinking about this too. And really just kind of an open question. Help me think about this. How can the community help us? And when we look at other analogies, this is sort of an interesting timeline. This is our estimates again. There's probably some open for debate, but if we just kind of look at over time, that's the x-axis, and we look at which of these bottlenecks are, again, adoption-only barriers, technology-only, or both, we kind of see, our estimates say roughly 80% of these bottlenecks will be cleared by 2030, more or less. Again, there's some estimation going on. We don't need 100% of the bottlenecks cleared. I mean, that's, philosophically probably impossible. But 80-20, when are these systems good enough for us to be able to really use them with confidence in the way that we're being teased to use them, but we're also a little scared to use them? So that was a shorter time frame than I thought. And it's those compound bottlenecks where actually it's both the availability of technology and these existential questions of, is this even right, are coupled. Those are obviously the stickiest problems. And when we look at the problems that are likely to last past 2030, it's just all about those combinatorial types of problems. So those are the hard ones. But we don't necessarily need all of them solved to start doing really interesting work. But this is sort of how I have to look at it, though, if I'm thinking about planning our infrastructure and our hiring to figure out where we're going to take things. So to summarize a little bit, here's what we really need. Trust, maybe that's the wrong word, but again, how do I know if I'm fooling myself? How do I know? There's so much opacity, especially once you put different versions of AI into what you're doing. That's not good enough, right? I have to, as best I can, really understand what's going in, how it's being combined, and how to interrogate that under, massive amounts of permutations to try to figure out what's really happening, so that I can even know if this is something worth continuing or just abandoning because it's not working. Access, right? How do you make something affordable enough? Yeah, but it's not just money, but simple enough for someone like me, not a PhD working on a really tough problem in a university, but somebody who's got an enterprise problem and is trying to solve these challenges at scale. So how do you dumb it down for us so it's so simple that we can deploy it and use it and feel good about it and understand the limitations of it at the same time? And then how can you give us something ideally where we don't, we can own it, right? Where we can see what's going on, what's going in, what's going out. We can reproduce the results. We're not held hostage by any particular vendor, right? How do you give us, these are the things that we're looking for. How do we chart our own course? How do we know what we're getting is right? And how do we even understand it? And not just some of us, but like our team and potentially investors or other people who are also being asked to rely on these models, who have even less visibility than we do as the ones building them. So faster hardware isn't my big problem. It's nice, but I don't even get to play with those toys if they're too far outside of our ability to understand what's happening, as much as I would love to. So the people in this room, right, you built fast machines, we're dying to use them, but help us make sure we're not fooling ourselves, right? What are the tools? And if I think of some of the standards bodies, not that standards are the way to solve everything, right? But was it ASME, or it took 20 years just to agree on what the words meant to understand if something it might be good enough or not, right? We don't have 20 years probably to work on this problem. There's sort of an anxiousness to deploy, but how do we get something in between perhaps? So that's kind of where I'm at in our journey. I hope that's helpful as just a different perspective. That's my email address, so email me. Honestly, if there's interesting things that we can learn from each other, that's why I'm here. And I think you'll find that we're dying to understand this situation better so that we can be more aggressive than our competitors, but that depends on you, right? Allowing us to have the tools and the visibility that we need to have confidence and to explain that to our partners when there's money on the line. So thank you very much. That was all I had for today. Any questions?
Thank you, Thomas.
Yeah. Thanks.
Any questions?
So I think you posed an interesting perspective on this dilemma, which is kind of known, but not always observed, that these bottlenecks are profitable, right? And increasingly, we see other bottlenecks now, DRAM, NVMe, other things being profitable, of which maybe those companies want to hold that market position for a while. I guess thinking about, and this isn't certainly in your role, but how do you envision the role of the public sector research enterprise going forward that a lot of this HPC AI revolution was built on? I mean, we've been using GPUs for over a decade in most cases, right? HPC for many decades, low latency interconnects, right? All these critical components. How do institutions play a part when some like mine have a $3 billion budget annually? We're never going to be able to buy the largest AI machines, even if we invested every dollar, right? Easy question.
Yeah, I mean, I can just speak from one person's experience, right? Again, I don't know how generalizable it is, but we're definitely aware that a lot of the cutting edge starts, in the labs or in the government institutions, especially in the U.S., and sort of finds its way to us enterprise folks over time. But I don't generally encounter. I feel like I'm on my own trying to find that, if that makes sense. And I know that might be my fault personally, right? But I certainly haven't come across too many ways to really be able to collaborate with folks in the labs or doing that kind of work. I mean, they probably exist, and maybe I'm just not doing a good enough job. But I do get the sense that I can read a paper when it's published, great. I can come to a conference and hear about work, but I don't feel like I know personally how to get under the hood in a secure way and have honest, open conversations with folks, especially in government, doing really cutting edge work. There probably are programs, but the fact that this is what I do for a living and I don't even know about them, maybe that's a watermark of where other folks like me are, perhaps, right? So I think there's a desire. Certainly I feel like, yeah, my gosh, I would love to have smart people who can help me understand this at a deeper level. Even if I can't build it, I can understand where it might be going. And I don't have a lot of opportunities in my typical month to do that. But would that be worth even a day a month? Yeah, actually. I mean, even in my calendar, right, for sure. So I hope that one person's perspective is helpful.
Is there another? Okay.
Thank you. This was really interesting to watch and listen. You had this picture that where you were going down to within 4 years. That one, within 4 years, we are already on 30% on a critical path. But what if there is within 4 years there is something unexpected bottlenecks that are coming that you haven't measured? So how are there in that picture or?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think it's inevitable that there have been unexpected bottlenecks that are going to, this is today's one guess of the timeline. All we know is it's going to be wrong, kind of a thing, right? But I will say what we did is think about, for each one of those roughly 1,000 technologies specifically across the value chain, we looked at supply and demand and the causality of those issues and used that causality to extrapolate the likely frame of when that might be resolved. So it was node by node, and then aggregated back up to a chart like this. So each one is sort of, imagine we did a meta-analysis of every technology based on what's known and did our best estimate. And they're sort of like, okay, less than a year, 3 to 5 years, 5 to 10, these big blocks, right, trying to estimate these timeframes. But we do know that there are going to be detours and paths, and it's not going to be linear, of course. But I think for me, my takeaway from this, and again, I actually would love it if we could better think about this timeline, to be honest, right? And model that, again, that would be interesting work. But even this, I kind of expected more of like a 15-year timeline for a lot of these bottlenecks. And I just was a little surprised that certainly at least this analysis showed, well, actually by 2030, you might be looking at 80%. I was a little taken back because I didn't think it would be anything that soon, if that makes sense. So I think we can debate it, and if it's flawed, that would be good for me to discover, right, so I can reacclimate. But more than anything, I was just shocked. I'm like, oh, so technology availability isn't the thing, even though it's all we obsess over, and a lot of this might be resolved soon. Oh my gosh, if that's true, that's a real game changer from what I had been anchored on prior. I hope that helps at least show how we're thinking about it.
Any other questions?
So looking at this graph here, mid-26, that's in like a month or two. What do you expect happens mid-26 that solves so many technology-only problems?
Yeah, it's a good, I think that, this is my guess, that the first band is less than a year that we're estimating. So I think we're sort of catching all the stuff that fell into that. So is it 6 months or not? I'm not sure. But I think it did suggest that, if you sort of look case by case and roll it up, a lot of the supply issues were kind of apparently, sort of 6 to 12 month lead time issues. So that's probably what happened there. Yeah, I don't know that it was some predicted like new war or trade thing. It was more just a fact of how we were measuring those chunks of time, if that makes sense.
Thank you very much. We'll keep our fingers crossed.
Yeah, let's hope, right? Unless the system found something that we should all be very alarmed about. And if it is, I don't know what that is. So.
Any others? One more? Okay.
More of a comment rather than a question. Coming from the U.S., there's a different perspective, especially on science and technology funding. It's under immense pressure. The administration has proposed a 55% cut to the National Science Foundation, a 10% or so cut to the Department of Energy, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the second year in a row. I think the community as a whole, these are lagging indicators and investments, right? You can't just invest and immediately expect returns, right? And we're seeing the results of that. So advocacy on the part of the private sector, for public sector science funding is important. So I think as you think about ways to build in the community, think about, well, what's that advocacy look like? Of course, we have liaisons on the Hill and everything, but it's a different message when it comes from the private sector. So if one of the things is in your head, I think that's a useful way for that exchange to happen too.
I welcome that, and tell me what we can do. Again, A, I'm just interested, but B, I have a vested interest in trying to see where the cutting edge work is being done. So yeah, how can we help? Because I agree, it's always coming from sort of the labs and the universities and on down to us. We know that, and if we can do more to say that and talk about the importance of it, yeah, just tell me where and when. I think any CTO who doesn't know that isn't self-aware. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.